Hey, welcome back. I figured we should end this year the way it started, with another cursed Nurgle. I've had this giant MDF circle in my junk pile for months now, and it feels just so good to finally get some use out of it. With my Daemon prints nearby for scale, I could begin the process of balling up foil to build up the armature. Once I had that shaped up with a spoon, I could start laying down some clay for Papa Nurgle's flesh. Very early on in this process, I changed my mind and decided the armature wasn't working for me. The squat that I chose was too similar to the standard grade Unclean one, and at that point, why bother making my own? I would eventually rip the loosely joined legs off of this shiny Thanksgiving turkey. Once I had the butt nailed down, I moved on to giving it some Joker scars on its belly. There are some parts of classic Nurgles I do enjoy, and I thought a big toothy grin on the stomach would be so much creepier with human teeth instead. I spent about 5 minutes trying to make individual incisors and canines one at a time, but then I had a rare moment of inspiration. Taping some popsicle sticks down to my work mat, I can shove some clay in between them and scrape the excess off with my metal kidney. And now I have an even, flat piece of clay for the teeth. This brain blast didn't stop there. Using the thinnest gauge wire I own, I made a very janky and temporary tool that I could use to get me 90% of the way there for the teeth with very minimal cleanup afterwards. It was at this point I really couldn't stand looking at those legs anymore and decided this thing was going to be so bloated and grotesque that its legs, if it had any, couldn't be seen anymore, crushed under the ridiculous weight of its distended stomach. From there, I began the tedious process of placing the teeth in one at a time, making sure I push the gums back to really add to the grossness factor, and taking my time to get the inside of the mouth as smooth as possible. We continue sculpting this creature's summer bod and give it some glorious pecs. For really big additions, I pack him with some foil first, and then I'm laying the Sculpey on a bit thicker than I normally would, since this will be the final layer for this sculpture, and I want it to be as strong as I can get it. A quick addition of foil and clay for an extra roll on his sternum, and then I could add on its tiny nipples. It's never not weird saying that sentence out loud. From there, I spent some time getting the body nice and smooth with the back of a spoon, so I could move on to undoing all that work with some texture rollers. All of these tools and stamps were made using leftover epoxy clay and a ball tool. This not only cuts down on the amount of time I need to texture everything, but by using the same set of tools, I can ensure that all my Nurgles will look similar, no matter how long it's been since I've sculpted them. From there, it was time for my first aromatic isopropyl bath, and once I was happy with the texture, I could start adding on the many clumps of boils. This is a great example of a part of the video where I could just do a fancy edit, wave my hand, and suddenly there's a bunch of boils all over this thing. But the truth is, a big part of sculpting is that it takes time. So while I'm stuck here in pimple purgatory, I want to take a minute and thank my patrons. With your support, I'm able to get new materials and continue these, quite frankly, ridiculous builds. So thank you. Anyway, once the sculpt was beautifully blistered, I used the leftover teeth that I made before to serve as the vertebrae, forcing their way out of the back of this brute. This is one of those familiar but wrong details that I like to include to keep the creepy factor consistent. Then we could finally take our ball tool and go to town, making tiny holes all over the body. If you've never seen any of my Nurgles before and suffer from trypophobia, this is me giving you permission to go ahead and leave now. For the final cleanup, I spent a good hour finding problem areas with my silicone shapers and asked my wonderful partner if she would help me look for fingerprints. Before I hosed this bodacious bod down with ISO and threw it into the oven for its first suntan session. From there, I got stuck and couldn't decide on what I wanted to do with the arms. I ended up doing a bunch of sketches, some big and beefy, others shorter and stubby, and some just weird. So in the end, I decided yes. Wrapping some smaller wire around my bigger wire, I got the shape of the arm that I was after and switched to using cosclay for the first time, which you can't tell, of course, because it's all just white clay. But while I sculpt the arms, here's some first impressions. It is super crumbly out of the box, like annoyingly crumbly, but once you knead it together, it's quite firm and holds its shape. I also find cosclay to be much stickier than its other polymer clay counterparts, so it stained everything I have ever loved and cared about. And finally, it smells like Design Master spray paint, which, if you know, you know. As I finished each arm and attached them to the body, I followed the same texturing process as before, starting with the stamps and rollers, punching in all the tiny holes, and finally adding on some clusters of zits. Then something amazing happened. I put this in the oven to bake, and when I took it out and inspected my new cosclay arms, I realized just how strong this stuff is. So I have quickly abandoned the old master of Sculpey and moved on to using cosclay for the rest of this project. Covering a ball of foil and baking it off, I started to build up a solid armature that I could work off of for the head. Quick tip, I like to put painter's tape down on my cutting mat when I need a small amount of super glue. That way I can just peel it off and throw it away with no mess and no fuss. To speed up this project, I cheated and pushed some clay into a mold of a skull so I could get the teeth and nasal cavity I was after, but without any real effort from me right now. Thank you, past me, by the way. Continuing to build up layers of clay and foil, working up from the rippling folds around its neck to its horrifying smile. It might have been easier to make the head as a separate part, but the disfigured fingers on the right hand weren't in the way too much, and I wasn't really worried about the cosclay breaking at all. Once I filled out the plump cheeks, I could start working on its Bart Simpson meets Frankenstein flat top and do my usual texturing pass. Stamp, stab, stick. I have a full video on the painting process for my Nurgles, and not much has changed since then. I follow the same basic steps and use the exact same paints, but I have gotten better at adding shadows where I want them and doing small details like the boils without accidentally painting the surrounding surfaces. The one saving grace here is that since the sculpt is so much bigger than the rest, little imperfections aren't noticeable from a reasonable distance. In the future, I think I'll avoid painting multiple creatures pale white since it's just so much harder to cover up those mistakes. In fact, if you're watching this and I ever decide to make a bunch of albino monsters again, please stop me. Okay, we're nearly there. We need to address this massive base now. After I smothered it with glue, sand, and more glue and ISO, I placed Papa Nurgle down to trace around it and painted the sand with a mottled brown color for all the spots where you would see it. Once that was dry, I put down more glue and a mulchy mix of terrain flock and finally sealed that in place. From there, I had to attach Papa Nurgle to his base so I could goop him up. The sickly sweet stomach bile that I love to paint on my Nurgles is a mixture of Fulgrim Pink and Flex Seal, which is basically like Mod Podge. This particular beast, this king of all things foul, consumes everything in his path and then spits out this acid and his victim's remains. To decorate the base with that important detail, I slapped a few quick coats of paint on some tiny skeletons, skulls, and heads, and stuck them into the goo before it dried. The last details were mixing up some clump foliage and adding a small fern here and a tuft there, and painting some touch-ups, but after that, I called it good enough. Thanks so much for coming to hang out for my last video of the year. I'm going to be taking a much needed break over the holidays so I can recharge and come back next year with new builds and ideas. Thank you again to my wonderful patrons and everyone who has supported the channel over the past few years. Be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with whatever comes next, but I'll see you soon. Bye!